everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, we are joined by Christine Calvert today. How are you today?
Hey, good. It's good to be with you, Joe.
Yeah, likewise. It's, I think, our first time ever recording together, and I'm pumped to share you with our audience.
Yes, me too. Me too.
So I'm trying to think about when you started coming up on my radar. I think I was getting notifications in the mail from GTT, Graph Transpersonal Training, about workshops. And you've been pretty close with the Graph Transpersonal Training group for a long time. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been probably about 16 years, actually.
Wow. Awesome. I was shopping as early as 2002, but I just couldn't pull the trigger. I had other stuff, as happens for folks.
I get
Um,
it. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I'm psyched you did it. And what, I guess before we dig too deep into that, how do you like to present yourself to the world? Like, I know you do a lot of great breath work. You've been doing all sorts of other interesting things, but how do you like to say what you're up to in the world?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm in a sort of slight costume change at the moment. So it's fun to sort of play around with some language with that. But yeah, I mean, holotropic breathwork is certainly one of the things that I'm incredibly passionate about, spend a lot of time um, in whether it's facilitating or teaching or learning. And second to that, I work as a clinician. I have a counseling practice, and then I also work with I do a lot of consultation with people that are training for psychedelic facilitation or a lot of prep and integration for people that are going into psychedelic sessions or any expanded state work. So that might be holotropic breath
Cool.
work or otherwise.
How are you, so you're living in Portland still, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. And then what kind of, are you, do you hold a certain kind of license, like an LPC or LCSW or something?
Yeah. I actually have a license. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, and there's a addiction counselor licensure out there that is an LCDC and licensed chemical dependency counselor. So that's actually my background. Um, and then I've, since sort of branched off from there, doing a lot of different trainings. But
Awesome.
that is the licensure, yeah, that I hold.
I feel like, the psychedelic world could learn a lot about LCDCs and apply that to harm reduction, education for people who are using, because, not all therapists even feel comfortable doing kind of like risk reduction ed for psychedelics. But I think LCDCs would, because that's kind of your thing, right? Like, how do we reduce risk and get people closer to healthy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It's a really good point.
Yeah, I love that. And so what came first for you, psychedelics or breathwork?
Addiction. Addiction came first. Hence moving into that field. And I say that with some levity because it's been almost 20 years since crossing that threshold. But so psychedelics, expanded states through the use of drugs came first. And obviously the set and setting wasn't there, so I think it's pretty safe to call it recreational. Although I did have some really potent and poignant experiences with psychedelics, during that time, and I remembered them. And when I moved into a place in my life where I chose abstinence for some time, I really was interested in continuing to explore my psyche, and I knew that there had to be more than just cognitive behavioral therapy and 12 steps and things like that, which were foundationally really important. And I just had this like seeker, you know, this tendency in me, this longing for something. So thankfully at 19 years old, I found holotropic breathwork.
Outstanding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Christina Groff in Stormy Search for the Self, I think, had just amazing language around like this seeker addiction thing. And it like reframed a lot of the kind of really scary stuff I was seeing people I knew going through. It's like, oh, you're also spiritually seeking. It's just a very different way, and one that might not get you exactly where you want to be. But it's still like struggling with a lot of the same issues. Yeah. Do you ever speak to that?
Yeah, I love. She actually has a book called "The Thirst for Wholeness," which I think may be some of the language you're talking about, where she talks really deeply in that book about and it's a sort of Jungian concept where um, the addiction or the reach for a substance is an attempt for wholeness, or a thirst for wholeness gone awry, if you will. So yeah, I think that was what I also understood, and it definitely took me until having a spiritual experience through a meditation practice that I actually recognized, oh, this is what I've been looking for all along. Same with holotropic. The second I had my first experience, I remember sitting up from that session just in tears, because I had arrived at the one thing I'd actually been looking for, which was a way inside of myself. Um, and some context for this really dynamic inner world. So, um, yeah.
Yeah. So people should understand what inner world looks like, or
Mm.
what it is, if they've been listening to the show for a little bit. So um, I guess we don't have to go there. But I love that idea of like the archetypes and like meditation helping open that up. And it's true. I see people talk a lot lately about risk in psychedelics, and like my counter argument lately is actually like risk in meditation. It's like meditation
Mm.
is very, very, very powerful, and you
Yeah.
don't know, right? Like people still have to go to the hospital after some meditation retreats. So um, it's not risk free, but people might just be less scared. And I don't actually even know the comparative numbers. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure people have
Mm-hmm.
to go after ayahuasca retreats or whatever too. So just something for people to flag and sit on. I have not seen it from a holotropic breathwork retreat, um, but it's a very different container and process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that kind of uh, like is breathwork, is this kind of like finishing stage of holotropic breath? Maybe actually let's start with what is holotropic breathwork?
Mm.
Yeah, from your
Yeah, that's a good,
perspective.
good question. Well, it's I think it's a worthy time to bring in Stan Groff's name. Stan and his late wife Christina Groff co-developed, and I really like to use the word midwifed because I think it speaks to the framework and the model um, in in a way that holds the integrity that it's so yeah that's so potent about it, which is that it's a process that uses breath and music in a certain set and setting to support expanded states of consciousness, and through the breath and again a certain sort of container, there's the psyche has this capacity to mobilize in the same way that it does when we take a psychedelic, and to start to bring really robust and dynamic material to the surface. And you know holotropic breathwork came at a time where Stan was at quite a peak of starting to have a really profound and um, wide map of the psyche that was really coming into fruition from his observation of thousands of LSD sessions. And it was a time when, as we know, LSD hit the street, became illegal. So he noticed some patterns in those sessions. One of them being that people would spontaneously move into this sort of deeper, faster breath rhythm, etc. And so he used that and his experience of ancient spiritual wisdom and his very scientific mind to sort of, again, like midwife this process that we know as holotropic breathwork. Holotropic meaning, moving toward wholeness. These are states of consciousness that have the capacity and I think the desire to move us toward wholeness to me, that means healing. And so that's a very short synopsis of the work. It's generally done in a group setting, although it can be done in an individual session. It's done generally in dyads where there's a sitter and then facilitators walking the floor. Same, setup as most expanded state work, like preparation, session, integration.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's a little bit about that work.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, and remind me of your question right before that. It was
So I was trying to like compare safety profiles of psychedelics to meditation to holotropic breath work and related techniques because I know of people going to the hospital after meditation and definitely after psychedelics, not necessarily in a container, but likely after a good container. But I haven't heard of stories after a holotropic breathwork session. And I wonder if it's something about how the group process and perhaps the bodywork can dissipate and help resolve a lot of the things before you kind of return to the world. And perhaps this is what's missing in the MAPS MDMA psychotherapy work is that they don't necessarily have formalized training around bodywork yet. Michael and Annie Mithofer, who are trained people in holotropic breathwork, they don't necessarily know what to say about it. I think they would like for people to be able to do bodywork, but how do you train that in a way that it makes sense to the FDA?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's tricky. It's a really sort of a kind of fragile dance relevant to touch. And I mean, what's coming up when you mention this is that I think one of the useful parts of the preparation that I'm used to is sort of informed consent about what will potentially arise. And so the sort of cartography of consciousness, or this map of consciousness or of the psyche that Stan developed through observation, which is a very wide-armed map. But it's useful in that someone said, hey, let's talk about all the potential here so that if these things come up within you, you've already been sort of informed that it's possible, because some of those are incredibly terrifying and very challenging and create a lot of internal tension. So having the information about the possibility or the power within was really useful in co-creating a container and an allyship with that potential, if that makes sense. I think in meditation, at least in my experience in meditation retreats, there's not often a lot of sort of prep or informed consent in that way. It's kind of like, and then we are often our only container, or it can feel like that. And so I think it feels easy to imagine that the tension building within somebody, especially when we're not expecting something, especially when we haven't really built a container for this incredible power within us, and to come through, then it can certainly cause that sort of a blowout, if you will. I wouldn't say people haven't had to get support after holotropic, but I think, again, the container, is really geared toward supporting that exact thing, making sure that people really understand what they're getting into.
And I was trying to differentiate like inpatient care versus like I need to talk to a therapist, right? So like needing to talk to a therapist is a no-brainer. Like of course you probably do, and it's a good idea. But like inpatient care, like we should try to avoid that as much as we can, in terms of like putting ourselves in a spot where we need it. But yeah, totally. Like I think that was some good info. So thank you for that. How has holotropic breathwork helped you?
Gosh, in so many ways. It's one, it gave me some context for, again, that the sort of early years of attempting to utilize things outside of myself for answers and just a sense of ease. And it has certainly given me an understanding that there is a great potential and power within me that will I'm pretty sure, continue to humble me for the rest of my life and amaze me. It's one of the things I love so much about breath work versus like, psychedelics, is that it is endogenous medicine. This is coming from within me. And as somebody who had experienced the world in a very, felt like I really was surrounded in a culture and a society that was incredibly disempowering. To have a model that turns you back inside yourself over and over again, um, is a true gift and an act of radical self-empowerment. And the creative and vital and, just force that gets to come from that, is incredible. It's allowed me really wide arms to hold a lot of things in for others, because it has, certainly been a portal to experience so many crevices and, caves and otherwise, within myself, from the like deep dark, the sort of darkest parts of humanity, what we might call the shadow, to put it lightly, and to, my transpersonal nature. And if you look at the sort of map that Stan built, or sort of, put language to, it is a map that can hold anything. So that means that I will never stop. I will never arrive at a point where I'm done exploring. And so it's given me a sort of awe around the healing process. Um, it's given me so much. Yeah, it's given me so much.
The first, so I guess let's do a little disclosure. I did a workshop with you. I don't even know when that was. That was probably 9 years ago, maybe. In
Yeah, maybe
Boulder.
even 10.
Beautiful
Yeah.
spot. Oh my gosh. That's crazy. But it's definitely likely. It was great. And the end of disclosure. But the way I like to kind of frame like how this stuff moves through us is like the thing with the strongest charge will present itself to us in some way or another. But we don't really have a way of predicting what that thing is at all, or how it's going to show up. There's, some folks trying to work on that, like Ren Butler and others in the space. But, what is that? And it's so non-specific.
Yeah.
I kind of, but, the thing with the strongest charge likely is the thing that's kind of wreaking the most havoc, or, pushing you a little more off kilter than otherwise, perhaps. But, this is just my frame. I don't know. Do you think similarly about that?
I really do. And I mean, I think the thing that I go back to, and I know you may have been going a little bit of a different direction with this, but is, the wisdom or the trust in the wisdom of the inner healer. And because it is so mysterious. I mean, I still get so nervous when I lay down on a mat, because it's so unpredictable. It's so unpredictable. It's so mysterious. It's so
Well, what is
strange.
this inner healer?
What is the what?
What's the inner healer? Like my simple metaphor is, in the same way your body knows how to heal a wound, it knows how to heal the psyche if you only can put the right things in place for it. Like, how do you like to think about it?
I
Because,
literally say
Stan's
the
pretty
same
clear.
thing.
It's right. It stands like it's not necessarily a thing in the way you might think by our, choice of label, but it kind of also is at the same time. It like is and isn't. You could like have it represented in a certain way in an experience. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's incredibly fascinating. It's, one thing I do know about it is it's a living principle, in the sense that it is always, deepening. It's always, I'm in constant deepening and apprenticeship to it. Within myself and in others, when I'm sitting or holding space, and for others. But it's, yeah, I mean, it's, people find their own language for it, and they get introduced to it within themselves in this work in different ways, which I love. And to me, it is this guiding force, within us, that has, our wholeness in mind, and is constantly moving us in the direction of wholeness, uh, even if that's unbeknownst to us. And it has this radical, potential to bring to the surface exactly the thing or the things, that need to be met and inside of us. And I think the psyche, if you will, and the inner healer is, for me, it feels like this team that is, is constantly like working behind the scenes to kind of understand, like, okay, how can we get her to see this time, And for instance, it's like in a session, an expanded state session, I may experience something relevant to, like, I don't know, my birth process that is a template or a pattern hooked into my system, to my body, to my being, that is still in effect, and it's another layer. There's a layer of that that's ready to be sort of chipped away at. So it may bring it in a form of metaphor. It's not like I will necessarily be in the womb experiencing, the this sort of environment in that way. It may bring it in, I don't know, a shark infested water, or something like this, where it can allow me to really engage with it in a way that is useful and has meaning. So I find that it's incredibly intelligent in that way, and
Right.
I've learned to really trust it.
There's some like historical metaphors that are coming up for me, like Porphyry or like Socrates, the daemon concept of like there's this inner thing that can help you.
Yeah.
Once it might be more you than your personality is, and that's an interesting one. And then like it's like the way you were kind of describing it it's really interesting because it sounds like a magical world, which it is obviously, but also like how we have all these things working for our success. So it's kind of like the opposite of paranoia, pronoia. It's kind of like that too. We have like trillions of things inside of us that want us to be healthy.
It's incredible. And it leaves no, I mean, if we give it the opportunity, and say yes to consciousness, it will leave no stone unturned. And then there's sometimes stones under the stone, So I think when we look at it that way too, what I've really had to embrace is the sort of spiralitic nature of my existence, and therefore my healing. And that it's become a lifestyle rather than an arrival point, because the more I get to understand the inner healer, I mean, one, I'm not only working on my personal biography, so that's what, that in and of itself is a lifetime of work, but then you add everything else, from the transpersonal, the archetypal, the collective, and we have lifetimes and lifetimes, and, the ancestral. It's, so it's, it just has this sort of unending, sort of striking potential to it.
I love that. Yeah. So what are you up to lately with breathwork? I think you just got off a retreat, maybe?
Yeah, I just did 2 weeks with Groff transpersonal training with I mean, it's just worth mentioning her Kat Bronigan is a Celtic shaman, so she was there teaching for a bit, and then we'd do breath work in the afternoons, and then the second one was like on the body work. So I just came out of a pretty deep immersion in that space, and then generally, like, I'm sort of popping around in different places, continuing to learn the best way to teach the benefits of this model in psychedelic space, psychedelic sitting. It's interesting to sort of kind of the crossroads there, and then the translation. And that's kind of what I'm up to. So lots of retreat work and teaching work around that.
How do you see it as a complement to counseling or therapy?
Psychedelic expanded state work in general, or
specifically holotropic breath work?
Oh my God, it's huge. I mean, even as like a person who does therapy from a sort of, deeply transpersonal and somatic perspective. Well, one, I think what I'll say is that I think counseling is at its best long-term subtle state work. you're doing these deep pieces of work, but often it's in the subtle realm. So it happens over time, which is beautiful. It's so, I think, real, relational, relevant. And then I think the expanded state work, particularly holotropic, can create openings and liberation for some of this material to come up, quicker, or in a way, not in a quick fix type of quicker, but just like we have more access to it. We can see deeper layers. Our protectors are maybe offline a little bit more because we're in a certain setting for that to happen, or they're really online, but there's a capacity to see them in a different light because you're not in your everyday experience. And I think it really supports, again, this allyship to the inner wisdom within us, which certainly comes from a good counseling session. But, if the therapist is continuing to remind you of that and holds that as a value also. But in holotropic breathwork, this is really about you and your inner intelligence. Like, we are not the ones that hold the answers. I think that's a huge benefit to the work. And I do see a lot of acceleration, when people come into these spaces and then go back into counseling, there's often access to things. I like the IFS language, so I'll use it, but there's more awareness and connection to parts that maybe we weren't able to do in, talk therapy or even somatic therapy. So I think it's an incredible compliment. I mean, I think that, not one is more useful or better, than the other, but they certainly support each other.
The
And
line that I've been
the
saying
relational piece. Sorry, I think that, I want to put a plug in for the sort of relational piece. And, obviously in counseling we get witnessed, but there is something really profound about the witnessing and the dyad setup model of holotropic breathwork, where I'm being witnessed by somebody, and their job is only to do that, to literally sit, accompany me as I go internal. And then there's just an immense amount of support. So for these parts that really didn't have support and are holding a lot of the trauma of omission, the things we needed that we didn't get, it's incredibly powerful and poignant to have this kind of relational field surrounding us through that, while that material is moving through us.
So how do you like to think about body work at the end? Like, obviously the witnessing is a big deal. And yeah, being part of a community that's doing these rituals, it's super interesting. And it is really nourishing. It's one of the biggest reasons why I just kept going back for so many years. Just the connection and the familiarity people, started to have with you, and vice versa. And how you could kind of have some peer support there, mutual aid and support, like big. But, the one thing that a newbie coming to a holotropic breathwork session is probably not going to do is body work, right? The facilitators are going to be there doing that kind of thing. And, you probably still see this once in a while. People think they have the right idea and start doing Reiki mid-session, or like, I'm going to give this person a lovely massage, even though we agreed that it's not supposed to happen. They still do it anyway. But like, how do you like to think about body work in terms of like a somatic technique, or what's it doing?
Yeah. I mean, I really love, I really support body work, in the holotropic space. With that said, I think I'll preface this by saying I recognize that, because of the way people have been harmed in the past, that body work and support through touch is not appropriate, and will become appropriate only when they feel ready for that. And that is perfectly and absolutely okay. With that said, and this comes from mostly my own personal experience, obviously.
Meaning an individual and their agency should be saying, yes, we should do body work, as opposed to the external person saying we need to do body work.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of it's probably one of my favorite things about the sort of, the Groffian framework. I mean, let's see, there's a lot to say here. So I'll say, one, the body work is still us following the person's inner wisdom, which is different than if we see you, let's say, crying on the mat, and we decide that maybe what you need is like a hand on the heart. Even though, I think this is really important, even though you may cry harder and you may have a huge release, and what will often come out of the mouth of somebody is, I couldn't have done that without you. Which is really tricky, because I think we did create some quality of support if we do it that way, but we also rob them of the like radical self-empowerment that this work really, really holds. So it's so much more poignant and, like, I think relevant when somebody reaches out for your hand, you know? And I've seen that over and over and over again. And if we do it any other way, if we do it any other way, I think we diminish and go against the one thing that we say we believe so strongly in, which is that your inner wisdom is the one guiding here. And that's what we are in facilitation too, And so, yeah, agency and expanded state work is, I think, a podcast in and of itself. I'm sure you've done many with many amazing practitioners.
It's so important.
It's so important.
Imagine if you have all that power that the researchers at Johns Hopkins or whatever had, and it was just you doing you, right? And you had some people keeping you safe and working you through the process. Like, fuck yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and it's just actually works better. Like, it works better when I'm a participant in the process, and that I've said yes, I've asked. Also, I think so much of the trauma web that we're trying to unweave is relevant to agency and empowerment or disempowerment. So it's really fundamental, and I think it absolutely matters that there's permission and invitation in. Second to that, I have to really put in the plug for how Stan originally came upon bodywork, which was the same way, in the sense that this is kind of, this from his LSD work, where at the end of the session, they would say, I don't have this thing in my back. Can you just hold your hand here? And they would naturally press into it, or they would just sit still, or whatever it was that they needed. But they were able to find, their body had the intelligence. Stan didn't do it for them. That would make him a doer. That would make him sort of categorize him as some sort of, healer. And so, because it's not working in shamanic space, that's not what we're doing here. And we definitely, as holotropic facilitators, don't want the responsibility. It's way too risky. So and then that was brilliant, where he was like, oh, they're telling me what to do, so I'm actually still following that intrinsic wisdom. And then he would see much more powerful responses. And I said, we say body work, but I think it's a little misleading, because you're
not getting a massage.
Yeah, it's not the massage technique we're used to. It can be like in the form of meeting pressure, where someone needs it, or we're just like providing resistance, meeting their pressure. But it can also be in the form of something really gentle, where we just place a hand where they've asked, or in the form of holding, a lot of holding, or some form of connection through contact. But it's not always this big cathartic thing.
Right. It can always be subtle. My first bunch of breathwork experiences are super subtle, even with the body work after. Yeah. And you're right. Like, the body can communicate in nonverbal ways to give the bodywork facilitator clues on what's next. And it's highly experimental. It's not programmatic.
That's right.
It's not like, oh yeah, we start with your feet and go up to your head and go back. No, it's not like that at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I just got out of the bodywork module. So, it's funny, because there's some techniques we learn because they just work on a practical level when you're trying to get into spaces that are hard to do. But the model I mean, the basic teaching around it is that, we're not, again, we're not the doers, and there's an intrinsic wisdom, and that's what we're following, period. With that, you can't mess it up. Because like you said, it becomes this beautiful exploration with the breather toward, toward the need, and they have the agency in that.
Yeah. And, so just so people kind of understand the process, right? Like from my perspective, sometimes people will reach out asking for help. Sometimes people will say things like, I think I'm done. And then you start like asking them about what's going on in their body, and there's a lot of activity, and you kind of like have a conversation. Would you like to check that out, or do you want to let that go? And you kind of let them say yes, right? And then they can say no whenever. You got a good safe word built in, and which is, I think, critical. Which, to further holotropic breathwork safety profile, the fact that you're in a room with a lot of people, like the room for abuse is a lot lower than it is in like a private therapy scenario. So I think there's improved safety there, even when there is touching. So a lot of people are really concerned around the ethics violations with touching generally. So it's a big one to just point out. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. What do you think people in psychedelics could learn from like Stan's bodywork practices that he co-developed?
Well, one, I think it becomes, okay, I mean, again, I want to just presence the fact that this is an incredibly tender subject in psychedelic space.
Just every topic here.
Yeah. And, touch is one of the things again, I feel like when we open this portal, I step into such the controversial potential. But one of the things I'm sort of curious about and maybe learning as I talk to more and more psychedelic therapists and their relationship with whether or not they will do touch is often relevant to their own personal experience with touch or harm relevant to touch. So, which makes perfect sense. And I think that we should absolutely honor and align ourselves with what is relevant to us. So what I mean by that is, oftentimes when I talk to therapists that are like, I absolutely will never touch anybody, that's my rule. They talk about it, they teach about it. Which I love. I mean, if that, like, yes, like that kind of passion and devotion to a great. What I'm finding, and it's intriguing, and it makes so much sense to me that it's like it gives them, I think, even more power, and it gives me more trust in them. Is that they've often been harmed by touch in their lives.
That
And
makes far more sense now.
Yeah, and so and oftentimes they're the ones working with people who have been very harmed by touch. And so it makes sense that their constellation is and their sort of flag that they stake in the ground is going to be relevant to that. I think we need it. I think we need a lot of different conversations about this because we all have different histories and we all have different relationships with boundaries and boundary intrusions. And I think the people who tend to be like more proponents of it have been deeply healed by touch and maybe had a lot of omission of touch or contact in this way. I'm using touch very broadly as a term, just physical contact. And this is a hypothesis. I don't know if it's true, but kind of what it seems like is that oftentimes the people who feel really strongly about it have personal trauma of commission. Old English, Stan uses it as a way of saying these are the things that were done to us that should not have happened. And that those who are more proponents of touch, contact, physical contact in expanded state spaces are often historically in their personal history have what we'd call trauma of omission. So they actually didn't get the physical contact they needed and were very healed by it.
I love that.
And again, I don't know if that's true, but I've talked to enough people or listened to enough teachers and podcasts and things where I'm like, And I don't think one is right or wrong. I'm thinking that we just need dynamic, a wide field to hold all of the conversations.
Yeah, I think it can't be categorically ruled out. Like bodywork needs to happen in some cases, not all cases. And yeah, I do love that because I'm the person that probably didn't, have enough touch, and I love doing bodywork, but in my workshops I rarely do bodywork because I know it just, typically my workshops are smaller and we don't necessarily have the luxury of a full weekend. So when you do bodywork, you can really open things up and let them unfold quite dramatically in a way that you might not have the resources as a facilitator to handle, and take care of everybody else at the same time. So I would, for years, just do the smallest ever bodywork, and
Yeah.
largely just on hands. So I'm like, I don't really want to go where I think your body wants to go right now.
Well, and I wonder too, like for you, if you experience this, I often wonder if it's more challenging too for men to sort of take up space in the bodywork offering, because of so much of our history. Um,
There, when I'm alone facilitating with like
mhm.
some relatively untrained support,
Yeah,
totally. When I'm with like a community that I trust and can work with, like I feel more okay to do it.
yeah.
Um, but it's because I have additional safety, for me to not get yelled at or something, right?
Hmm,
Like
hmm.
I remember a workshop I did ages ago where somebody felt really unsafe around me, and I was like, fascinating, because it's the first time that's ever happened in my whole life.
Mm,
And I'm like, wow, what is this? But obviously processes get amplified and
yes.
projection happens, right? But I was on edge for a good 6 months after that. Like, what did I do? What am I doing to show up this way? It was a wild one.
Yeah, those are interesting. I feel like it's one of my teachers says they have to trust you enough to project on you. They actually have to feel safe enough to feel unsafe, or to care,
Yeah.
to have this sort of like such a strong projection. And you know the I think body work and non-ordinary state work in general. I think I switched before between non-ordinary states and expanded states. My preference is expanded states, so I'll stick with that. Is that it isn't technique based. Even when we learn, our facilitator manual for body work. I wish I had it near me so I could show you. And is this
Here's
flimsy
the methods.
sort of printed out
Hmm.
and then like put a spiraled book, and it's really the conversation that's happening in there is like, we can tell you how to do these things, a few practical techniques, but if you trust in the guiding principle here, the inner healer, you're there's no technique you need to know because you're just listening and following the body. Obviously technique is helpful, like if we're working with the pelvis, how do we do that in a way that's as non-intrusive as possible, and safe and respectful. So it's techniques about, if we're working with certain parts, how to stay respectful, how to not harm the body, like don't work directly on the spine, these things. So we have a lot of techniques. How do you work with the eyes when somebody needs support there?
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's not a massage class. So if we had a roadmap
Hmm.
like that, it may feel less dangerous and tricky for people, but it would also feel intrusive and we would become the doers, and that's not what we're doing in this kind of work, and so I understand why people are hesitant to do contact. um,
This tension of wanting a program to follow, do you feel like that's prevalent in psychotherapy generally? And then, like, what do you think the limitations of a manual might be?
so many. I mean, I think it gives the mind, it's like the cognitive candy, gives the mind something to settle on. I think it's a way we've learned in our society to feel safe, and to feel like we are connecting to, it's some way we've learned to connect to lineage and this sense of kind of feeling successful in a thing when we understand it, when we've acquired the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've even learned, and I certainly have my own version of this, like to, if I can mimic it in language, then I have something. And it's interesting, especially in this type of work. And I think ultimately so much of the real, I think, thing we're looking for in psychotherapy is something that was actually more relevant to, these sort of ancient spiritual wisdoms, which came through, the lineage that was handed down was often um, not written down. It was a transmission. And I think we're looking for a resonant field. We're looking for a place for humanity to exist. We're looking for places to come as we are. And there's just not a manual book that can teach us that. And
Mm-hmm.
I talk about this when I talk about facilitator practitioner self-awareness a lot, which is like, I don't have slides. I don't have a PowerPoint for this. It's the conversation is going to be different every time, because self-awareness is not something you can teach. There has to be a felt sense, something that lands, that's resonant, that excites you, inspires you, enlivens you to then go look at that thing for yourself, hopefully not through a book, but hopefully through doing your own inner work.
We've been talking a lot about Vital lately and how people come thinking they want to be a facilitator or something, and then they realize, oh my gosh, I just need to do a year of deep inner work. And like I find that fascinating. So like the education makes them transform, and I think there's something there. Um, don't know what that is, and I think you see that in GTT land too. Like,
Yeah,
oh, I want to go be a facilitator, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's just so much here that all I want to do is the inner work until I'm ready to share.
totally. Yeah. But I think that speaks to, like, when I hear that about Vital, it speaks to the teachings, the wisdom that's coming through, because people, I don't think, get to a place where they're like, oh, I think I need to do more work on myself, when they feel like they're learning only cognitively and getting the message that that's all they need. So what I'm hearing in that is that you guys are offering something. It's asking them to look deeper, and inherent in that, in the depth of the teachings, whatever they are, educational, academic, or otherwise, like there's something that's hitting that says, yes, I have to go do this thing, and
Mm,
go do deeper inner work. To me, when people say that, I'm like, oh, you got it. Like those are the people that I want to do actually finish the psychedelic trainings. The ones that are like,
mm,
oh shit, I need to take a year and just do my own work.
right. Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of exploring left to do. Um, and the programs don't really make space for it, partly because it's so expensive. It's just so hard to introduce psychedelics. And I think Breathwork is a great model. Kyle asked Rick Doblin when was it? Sometime this year. I think it was at Maps Denver. Um, do you think holotropic breathwork could be used as a training tool for MDMA sessions? And he's a really quick no, which was fascinating to me. I don't think holotropic breathwork personally can be like the only
Yeah.
experience somebody has if they want to go in and do this stuff. They should be exploring. What do you think?
I mean, I feel like everybody's going to find their own medicine. Like I would disagree with the quick no easily, um, because I've seen the translation so many times. Um, but I think I also am not like, I don't hold it in this hard way. Like it's the thing, the only thing, and the best thing. I'm like, I actually don't agree with that. I think, however, if people come in and do holotropic breath work, do like the training, whether it's, and let's just, I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing great work that have trained under the Groff framework and the holotropic framework. So like, and there's training in there. I mean, I'll just say personally, the best training I've ever gotten for psychedelic space is the that model. It's not that there's not room for evolution or expansion, but the guiding principles that are there, and the way that they consistently hold them and the integrity that comes from that container is really profound. And yeah, I actually do think I feel like if we could do a stepping stone program, breathwork would be the first one, because I think if we can't access and understand who we are with this our own endogenous medicine as explorers and facilitators or practitioners, I think we're missing something. And I'm not saying
Mm.
holotropic breathwork is the only way to find that. It's like, let's do some somatic experiencing and understand our relationship with our own nervous system, just something, before we go sit with another nervous system. So I think it is more about, yeah, I mean, this is an area that gets me very fired up. And I think the holotropic just offers one option to bridge a gap between non-psychedelic work, psychedelic work, space holding, you know. Yeah. And this is not like the truth of the capital T. This is simply my personal experience, and then hearing and witnessing the experience of a lot of other people. And I am
Yeah.
biased. I mean, I am biased for sure.
Right. Same here. Like what my experience was is what I wish a lot of people could have for their experience. But I know it's just not appropriate, right? I think I did 6+ years of quite regular holotropic breath work before jumping into the psychedelic arena. And the whole time, of course, fiending for the larger psychedelic experiences. Yeah. But I had this real kind of dark night of the soul experience at one breathwork workshop. I might have told you about this. I don't know, but my body knew what we were going into. I was, apprenticing a little bit, saying like, okay, I'll do the relaxation exercise. Great. But my body was like really, really queued up. It was just ready to go. So after the relaxation I put my head on the pillow. Before my head was even on the pillow, before accelerating my breathing, there was no drugs involved. I was having the most intense experience I've ever had in breathwork. And that was just like, your body knows, all right, this is what we're up to. Great, let's do it. And, it was a 5-hour ride. I was definitely the last person in the room by a long shot. And yeah, the whole world was on fire, metaphor or not, I don't know. But it's it's the thing where you have to rebuild yourself after. Okay, yeah. Now that everything's gone, what's next? What do I bring back in that I want?
It's true. And it's so, I mean, when I hear you say that, I'm like, that is powerful, to know that, again, if we're in the right setting, our body, our being will do exactly what it needs. And yeah, I mean, I think for some people, my hope is just that we can find something that is grounded and allows us to understand the power within prior to putting a psychedelic in our body to have to do that. And what I also understand is that people will try and try and try. I've seen people come into the breathwork over and over and over. They cannot break through. Their protectors are so fucking strong, They're not, it's not going to happen. I mean, I've watched people do this for years, and then they go, do an LSD session, and they finally cross the threshold. And then they can maybe come back into the breath work, and they just have more access to something, or vice versa. The first time I ever went to the jungle and drank ayahuasca, I was like 10 or 12 years into, maybe 10 years into the breath work, a long time, and had done so much work in there, so much deep work. And I went to, that experience, and it was one of those that will sit on the altar as one of the most profound and terrifying experience. It was just one of those Aya experiences that you're not sure if it re-traumatized the shit out of you or actually healed something, but those, yeah. And And it was my first time. And I literally would not have come out of that mentally, emotionally, and spiritually intact. I can guarantee it, if I didn't have all of that breathwork experience under my belt and a capacity to navigate such complex states within myself. It was so dynamic, so complex. And yeah, I don't think I would be okay having not had that capacity to understand um, through the breath work how to work with these parts. So
Mm.
that's one other thing that comes to mind.
So I'd love for your comments on this. So Stan Christina's creation here of holotropic breathwork, um, it was informed at Esalen not only by Stan's experience, but everything he was seeing at Esalen. So like yoga, experimental psychotherapy methods, all
Strong.
sorts of weird stuff that people were up to at Esalen. And one thing I really appreciate about this kind of current, if you will, is this willingness to engage in comparative religion, comparative spirituality, like kind of a la Joseph Campbell or something. And then you're not in this weird void space of contemporary psychology where the grounding is, not so firm, let's say, because it's new.
Yeah.
Versus thousands of years old, right? And to yoga, to further kind of what you were saying, like if someone's doing yoga like Patanjali style, like really religious style, like asana is there to prepare the body. It's not necessarily like the be all end all in that kind of religious pursuit, but it's preparing the body for these bigger things. And perhaps in a way, holotropic breathwork is sort of doing something similar.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that. And I mean, what's funny too is some people have done just a massive amount of psychedelic work in their life. It's been profound. They'll come into the holotropic and they're like, that was the most profound and terrifying psychedelic experience I've ever had, Um, so it's just like we don't know. And I think my hope is that we can just be really careful about any absolutes when we're talking about this space, because we don't know. And what we know, the only thing we really have to offer is, I'll borrow this from the 12-step wisdom, our experience, strength, and hope, period.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, yeah, the researchers that have dedicated their life to that get to bring in a different sort of element of what that means. And, a lot of mine comes from my personal work and working with others directly on the mat, and somebody else might come from another means. But yeah, it's I think one of the biggest things around this movement right now that I really plant a seed of hope for is that we can I think it's important to be opinionated, because I think it's where passion comes from, but to also, as people who I think all carry a lot of passion and wisdom, can also leave room, just to leave room. And because the medicine, the collective inner healer, if you will, I believe really wants us to figure this thing out and find the safest way to provide support. And there's a lot of different dynamic ways to do this. And God forbid we ever end up like the medical model, where they say there's one way to do it. And that's what I love about, this kind of work. And what you're doing and what you guys do here is like, it's so dynamic, and you bring so many people in to share and really give language and form to the dynamicism that is here and available. And it feels important to, I guess, plant the seed of hope around, openness and a willingness to be apprentices to observation. What we're actually seeing is useful to people, not what we think is useful.
Right. And leaning on decades, centuries, millennia of tradition versus somewhat weak arguments from researchers about why this thing is superior to
Mm-hmm.
everything else. It's like
Mm-hmm.
only because there's been like data and resources put there, right? Like we haven't gone to try to like validate certain other methods, right? Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think this is why, I know we're probably coming up against time, but I'll just say that there's this sort of karma, if you will, that I've noticed within. Um, I mean, I can speak to holotropic breathwork the most. That's my, main gig here. But it's like trying to do research on that work is so hard because you're trying to contain one of the most dynamic principles of existence, which is a human being, into a form, a category. And it's not. I believe that if we do that, we're doing it a disservice. I also really respect research, so I'm not. It's just I've kind of appreciated the ways in which it's been a struggle for people to find or maintain researching this method because we're trying to research the human psyche and consciousness, and that feels impossible and it feels constricting. And um, so
mhm.
we are just
Yeah.
all so different and we all have different needs and we all have different expressions of experience.
Hmm. Yeah. Everybody's so individual. And like to you, my favorite analogy is like Play-Doh Fun Factory. Um, like it just doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like extruding pasta or Play-Doh or something. It's everybody's so unique.
Yeah.
And if we're not acknowledging that and respecting that in an important way, like we can fall very short of what we're promising folks. And I love how you were putting that, just like openness to the experience as opposed to like how well can I follow the formula.
Yeah.
I think it's
And
big.
not that there's not room for protocol, and obviously safety comes through protocol. And that's, I imagine that people can sort of filter through what I'm saying around that. Like, I'm not saying that I mean, I'm a huge fan of like structure and protocol and things, but I think there's a limit to how much we can, you know, throw a net over all of this and say it should be this or it is this or this works best, period. It's like that feels like a waste of energy. I think we can be co-creative in different ways. So
Right.
yeah.
Um, so anything else we missed that you really want to throw in?
Nothing that's coming to mind. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, likewise. And I feel like we need to do this more often. This feels woefully inadequate that we haven't had you on yet. And like the way you're coming at this work is so aligned with ours that it's just, great to hear it from somebody who's not
Mhm.
inside PT or yeah. So I love that.
Yeah, I really
And
appreciate you
what was
guys.
the webinar you did the other day? Can you speak about that in case people want to check that out?
Yeah, it was practitioner self-awareness for Vital. And
Mm,
yeah, it was really great. It was a kind of an opportunity to talk about a lot of what you and I have, and sort of ask people to look at some of the areas that maybe there's a little bit of shadow or inquiry that needs to happen, particularly around like topics like sexuality and aggression, power, privilege, these
hmm.
these things.
Yeah, it's big. It's really
Yeah,
big.
huge, huge,
Um,
huge.
it's like a fascinating idea to me that people could make it through become a licensed therapist and have very minimal self awareness.
Hmm.
But it's
Hmm.
it's everywhere, right? It's not
Everywhere.
culture isn't set up to like protect against people that don't have self awareness. It's
Yeah,
set up very differently. So it's a big important topic, and I think could really really help therapy generally.
yeah. Me too. Me too. That's really, I think, one of my areas of deep passion is how do we do that? And not to teach it on a slideshow, but like really get people in
Hmm.
the deep sea of themselves.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. All right, Christine, what's your website in case people want to follow up with you?
Yeah, it is alchemicalnectar.com.
Wow, that's great. I've been studying alchemy, of course, as you do, and it's there's so much there.
So good.
Uh,
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Christine, for joining us. Everybody check out Christine's website. There's always retreats coming up, so stay tuned. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Until next time.